Greetings, art history students. I hope you're doing fantastically well. Coming to you today from one of my favorite cities in the world. This is Salzburg, Austria. Austria is considered one of the most famous places, one of the best places to live anywhere in the world. And this city, Salzburg, meaning the burg or the city of salt, was a Renaissance power and later on a Baroque power for the salt industry for curing meat. It is the birthplace of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and the foundation of classical music. You see the castle up on the hill, which gives you beautiful, beautiful views over the river. The three musicians we'll be talking about today as part of our Baroque music concert series are these. We're going to be looking at Vivaldi with his red hair, who was called the Red Priest, who lived from 1678 to 1741. We're going to look at Friedrich Handel, who lived from 1685 to 1759, and Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, who has a whole litany of progeny who are going to continue on in his way, who's considered the father of harmony, who lives from also 1685 to 1750. Baroque artists, musical composers, and philosophers, they begin to work together under courtly patronage system up at royal palaces. And so the aesthetics that we saw in Baroque art are going to be some of the same aesthetics that carry over in Baroque music. And so the Baroque aesthetics that we saw already, calm classical movement, the idea of this organization that shows up. We're going to have the idea of movement that's going to develop, which you'll hear in classical music, or Baroque music. It's going to be audience involved. It's going to be emotional. We're going to have a lot of Christian symbolism. It's going to be theatrical, patrons, the church, and the upper class. Those are our Baroque art aesthetics. If you look over here, you can note the similarities. Note the ones in orange over here under Baroque aesthetics are also the ones that appear over here. Baroque music has three elements. One, basic emotional mood, which is called the affect. If you start out happy, you're going to end up happy. If you start off sad, you're going to end off sad. If you start off pensive, you're going to end up pensive. It's going to be highly repetitive. Themes and refrains, a ritornello means a little thing that returns within the music. And the patron is almost going to be exclusively the church, about 85%. Music is very expensive to make during this time period. So I am going to actually show you and have you listen to a piece of Baroque music then. By Handel. Now note, the things that I want you to listen to in this particular fun piece of music are the following. Note, there's one basic emotional mood, the affect. So here's what I'd like you to do. While we listen to this piece of music, you get one word. I want you to write down the one word that best characterizes the music, whatever adjective or adverb, I guess, you would like to write down. One and only one to demonstrate the affect that shows up here. And then I'll tell you what that affect is more commonly around the world. The second, repeated rhythms, the refrains. I want you to count the number of times you hear certain phrases. For example, count the number of times you see or you hear the words hallelujah. So whenever you hear or see, as you'll see, the word hallelujah, check it off. How many times did you hear it in this 3-minute piece? And also, he shall reigneth forever and ever. And finally, the patronage is going to be the church and liturgical. So we want to make sure that you know that, of course, with hallelujah here, it's mostly going to be church music that we are going to hear. So here's Handel's Hallelujah Chorus. Originally designed, as you think about it, as it talks about God coming back, he shall reign forever and ever, was about the resurrection of Jesus. But Handel, so it was meant to be played in the Easter season. However, Handel actually was performing it and actually rehearsing it well before Christmas to make sure that it went well for the king's performance. The king walked in on one of these performances, heard it, and said, wow, I can't wait to hear this on Christmas. And that's why today it's associated with Christmas music, because the king walked in beforehand. Also, when the king walks in, you're expected to stand, because the king is the person who has to sit down first. Very similar to the way the courtroom works. When the judge comes in, we all stand up, and then the judge says you may be seated, and you all may be seated in that in the aftermath. So we have the same thing coming up that will show up. So generally you're supposed to be hearing this in Easter while sitting in the pews of a church, but today we often stand during Christmas. The word that gets written down mostly as you're writing down that one word, the word that gets written down most often is celebratory. And so what I like about this video is it does illustrate very clearly the three foundational elements that we're going to look at of Baroque music, at least as they're going to impact the arts. And we can share over with the aesthetics of Baroque art. So one basic emotional mood, which is the affect, a repeated rhythm, themes and refrains called a ritornello, and patronage of the church, largely liturgical, for about 85%. Now, when we talk about Baroque music, besides the three elements that are going to show up, we also need to talk about harmony, the idea of Bach and the invention of harmony. He's generally considered one of the greatest musicians of all time and often will be placed third behind Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and far behind then Beethoven, who generally comes in number one. And what he's just able to do is astonishing, which we'll see next week. The piece of music that I want to play you is a piece of absolute music. Basically means that it comes along, or the idea of absolute music is music for music's sake versus program music. Program music is meant to go on with a theme or an idea. You'll note that what's here is going to be called Bach's toccata and fugue. Toccata is an Italian word which means touched. Fugue is an idea of counterpoint where there's multiple melodies that are playing basically to make the melodies make each other sound more beautiful when they are played on top of one another. So there are 13 different pieces of counterpoint, and normally you only need 2. So 13 makes it very challenging to play. The called toccata Bach's toccata and fugue because it was meant for a keyboard. So that's the touched aspect. And this was meant to test the winding organism inside of a church organ. At one point, it pulls out all the stops. So at the top of an organ, there are these bellows, and at the top of the bellows, these are these stops that allow the flow of air to come in. At one point, all the stops get pulled out, which means all the air is rushing through the entire bellows. They're being played on the organ, which means that you hear the whole range of sound within the church. It kind of fills it with this heavenly image. And so when we use that phrase today, if you've not heard it, we say, pull out all the stops. It is specifically a reference to this piece of music, which tests the winding organism in an organ. And so pulling out the stops means you do everything. When you go on an interview, pull out all the stops, do everything to make sure you get hired and get offered a good salary in that job. So it is a phrase that comes from this. So here's Bach's toccata and fugue. And you'll see it's set to horror music because it does sound pretty horror-like. It was the original theme soundtrack to Dracula, as well as Nosferatu, way back in the 1920s and the 1930s, and many other horror films, and it is still the sound of Halloween today. Here's that touched part. Later on, Friday the 13th is going to use as part of their soundtrack for the original Friday the 13th when it came out in the 1970s. No, it'll have one basic emotional mood or affect the entire way through. You're going to hear the exact same repeated rhythm, themes, refrains, a ritornello, the little thing that return. You hear it's actually a counterpoint with the melody. And it did have church patronage, even though it was generally not used to show an image of hell or anything, which easily could have been done. It was to test the winding mechanism at an organ. If you go to Wrigley Fields today still where Chicago Cubs play, go Cubs, when you go there, they will actually, this will be the first piece of music they test on the organ because they have a live organ that still plays there. I think that's the only ballpark in America still like that. So if you come home day one night and this is what you hear playing in the background, go back out. There's probably something bad that's going to happen in your house. Foreshadowing. Now, as we listen to music and move farther within our course, one of the things that we have to show up is that musicians, just like artists, get to manipulate different variables to create music and influence their audience. Remember that artists use the basic elements of design to manipulate their audience. So do you remember what those elements are? The basic elements of design that are used to manipulate the audience to make you think, feel, get a message across in a particular way. Good. Color is going to be one of them. Line, form, scale, and texture. So that's what we get to manipulate. We can change the color to make you feel happier by using brighter colors or more dark and morose by using darker colors. We can manipulate the line to make you feel calm by using more horizontal lines or vertical lines if we want you to think upwards and look upwards and think about that you're not that significant in front of whatever happens to be because the building is so much taller or Jesus is so much higher than you. We can use the idea of the scale. Something that's small like the Mona Lisa is meant to be approached even though it's kind of about the same size as the human head. Whereas if we made a giant image of Jesus, like the giant Jesus in Brazil that overtops the hill, it's an overwhelming to show about the power and God's grace that he provides before us. So these are the different things that we're looking at when we manipulate those elements of design. So if that's the case, what variables do musicians manipulate to create music and influence their audience? Right, so they're going to manipulate dynamics, right, to make things positive or negative, or how close to danger or how close to happiness is. We can play with the volume. We can change the instrumentation. We can go from strings to woodwind to brass. We can change the tempo. That's the rate of the speed of notes are coming at you. So if the music very slow and maybe we have 60 beats per minute or 60 notes, basically the rhythm of a human heartbeat, which is about average, all the way up to 120 or 180 different beats per minute. So the music is coming out as very fast and it's very festive. The timbre, or we could actually change the sound quality. Is it kind of fuzzy and buzzy? Or is it got a crystal clear, like gently comes out of a violin? So these are the different manipulations that come up. Now, the artwork where we want to play around with this is called La Primavera. This is a spring. It means spring. It's from a poem. And it's allegro, which is the tempo, which means lively, which means that this is going to be a fairly active beats per minute when we look at it, probably somewhere in the allegro between about 90 and 100 beats per minute. So basically the poem that goes along with it. So now remember, the piece of music that we're going to be listening to then, because there's a poem, is called program music. This is the vast majority of what program music is. The same way that music is not composed generally before the visuals see any images when they're making a movie. So the choreographer and the musician, they work together to make sure that the music matches up specifically with the visuals and what they're trying to get across. This is actually the most common form of program music. We also see this in video games. So what we have to manipulate the variables on then to get the idea across is this poem. Springtime is upon us. The birds celebrate her return with festive song, and murmuring streams are softly caressed by breezes. Thunderstorms, those heralds of spring, roar, casting their dark mantle over heaven. Then they die away to silence, and birds take up their charming songs once more. And so if we have the idea, based upon this, if we can manipulate the volume, the instrumentation, the tempo, and the timbre, so the volume, the instruments, the rate of speed, and the sound quality, how are we going to show birds? Right? Birds are probably going to be stringed instruments. And the different calls of birds are probably going to be different aspects of either the notes of them. It could also be the timbre of the notes, right? Some birds are more squawky. Some birds are most calm and soothing. We could change the rate of tempo, flying around and rushing around, so we get faster tempos, or is it more calm and peaceful and resting? Now, if it's spring, it's probably just waking up from its somber slumber or from the migration to get it back actually from having wherever it was in the southern part of the United States or South America to where we currently are. Remember, this is an area of Europe where Northern Europe, where they actually have 4 seasons. And so the birds generally do have to migrate. So here's that piece of music. Now I do want to point out the ritornello is this little thing that returns. So we're going to start off with the 2 melodies, A and then B. So each is about 7 seconds long. To make sure you get the A melody, they play it a second time. The B melody, they're going to play that a second time. Now after the melody plays in this first part, you'll note there's nothing, right? Because it's not the ritornello, it is actually the program. So the program music is the song of birds that they're showing here. So whenever we do A, B, B, whenever you see that ritornello note, it's the full orchestra. Whenever you see the opening here, you'll note the instrumentation is almost always going to be strings. And your job then is to think through the affect. Remember, the affect is going to be the same throughout the entire piece. And so we're going to go from ritornello to center us to the different elements from the poem. Song of birds, then we're going to hear a stream, then we're going to hear a thunder, then we're going to hear a song. It's going to be your job at the very end to figure out what is it at the end of spring that's bringing us towards summer and the ending ritornello. That's what we're going to be listening to. This is the A melody. Second A melody. This is announcing spring has come. Note how festive and vibrant it is, how clear. B melody. B melody again. Note how the variables of the instrumentation have been changed to give you the song of different types of birds here. So a more lilty bird here with the timbre. We're headed to the ritornello to center us again. That's the ritornello, the B melody. Now we're going to hear the sounds of spring streams. Soft running streams. Note a little variation coming up here, a little trickle around a rock. And we're going to return to the B melody. And now we're going to get nice thunder and lightning, happy thunder and lightning, spring thunder and lightning, not hurricane thunder and lightning. All using strings. Back to the B melody, 7 seconds to frame us. And now another later bird getting closer to summer birds. Note the difference from earlier birds. It's almost as if the heat is starting to get to them. Return to a variation on the A melody. And here's the question mark for you. What is this sound then that leads us into summer? It comes right here. I'm going to finish with a double B melody. Second B melody. Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and particularly this one, the spring season, were so successful that if I were to play the beautiful and show you the lovely music that shows up here, that's the summer coming, as I was actually, if I would play this piece of music for you as it continues on in front of these images, you wouldn't even question it. We use it in all sorts of movies that deal with spring. So whether it's things that have to do with the Easter Bunny that are running with spring that shows up in Peter Cottontail, if it's a spring wedding, this music is almost always used. It just is really synonymous with the sound of spring, kind of the idea of rebirth after a wintry fall or wintry winter, and all the snows and breezy winds for people that have 4 seasons out of the year. And so after we look at these, and I can move myself out of the way to show you, one of the questions that showed up if we didn't do it in the last class is this. So now that we have music also to consider, which artwork is the best representation of all of Baroque art, thought, and culture? Is it the Bernini with the Roman Catholic South? Is it the idea of the Caravaggio, who challenged the notions of the Pope in Counter-Reformation art and kind of lives in that Northern Italian where we can play with it? Is it Gentileschi, who takes Caravaggio's tenebrism and adds the female empowerment? Is it Rembrandt, taking that tenebrism all the way to the north and adding the new features that show up with Dutch art in the Dutch Golden Age of still life and genre painting? Is it the Rubens, who's the first international style that combines the elements from both the north and the south with the new features then of that diagonal composition for that energy? Which artwork is the best for explaining the entire history? And the Baroque then is going to lead us into this era of Rococo. Part of the reason why we're going to lead here, I'm going to skip one. Part of the reasons we're going to lead here is because many women for the first time at the same time are going to become the queens and kings ruling over Europe. And so this is going to bring us into a Rococo period. So I do apologize, but I think it's interesting sometimes to look how things are taught from the past. So this is a video from the late 70s, early 80s that specifically deals with the elements of Rococo. But what it does really well is give you kind of the oversights and give you a view with some of the images that show up. You'll note it does look dated, which is fine because it's still one of the best pieces, shows you the information from the Rococo. So when I was learning about Rococo the first time, these are the type of videos that I would have seen. It's very effective still today, but there's no graphics or animations. We just didn't have that technology yet. So rocaille basically means a shell that is slightly opened. And part of that might be the idea that women had different interests in ruling. It wasn't all about power in the aftermath of the war from the Baroque and the Protestants versus the Catholic revolt that basically took place that destroyed Europe. They might have wanted a thing that was not nearly offensive, that would bring people together. And what better way of doing that than through love and the arts? And the master then, of course, is Watteau during this time period. You can see these lavish parties that start to develop. Most famous artwork we'll cover is actually the Fragonard, and it is a woman on a swing that we'll actually see, which is coming up right here on your right, just scrolling up now. So it's going to be on a new style of luxury, love, on courtly playtime and playthings that develop. It's a much more fun time than the Baroque with those serious things because of the war that is basically taking place throughout the vast majority of Baroque society. There are people warring against one another. But the frivolity of this is eventually going to lead us to our next art movement, which is all about the revolt of the very poor. Look how fun and playful the artwork is and the decoration. There you can see some of the decorations that show up. The greatest friend of all the Rococo was this beautifully laced stucco all over buildings. The same stucco with the same kind of proportions that we put on the outside of our houses to protect the concrete here in Florida. There you see the beautiful stucco work everywhere. So you can see this becomes the style all over Europe, specifically at the emperors where women had a lot of power. That was the Schönbrunn prowess from early on in the Palace of Catherine. And the greatest thing that actually shows up is the interior design. It really is famous for interior design and Rococo furniture with these spirally handles, which we really hadn't seen before. They're in the shapes of shells. So one of the most famous Rococo images, it's almost the Baroque gone wild, right? So they were looking at love, and they were looking at the idea of kind of joy and wonder coming out of this very dark time between the fightings between the two. But one of the most famous then, of course, and I'll move myself up here, is the Hall of Mirrors by Mansart at Versailles, which is spectacular. It's a narrow hallway for a palace size. But what makes it beautiful is that the opposite side is all mirrors. So it reflects the beautiful gardens of Versailles. So it doubles the elements and you get double the chandeliers. It's like the chandeliers are almost floating in this garden setting, and it's actually beautiful. It's incorrectly sometimes labeled as late Baroque. That is not really a thing. We could say things were at the end of the Baroque period, but the Baroque really does end, and then the Rococo begins between about 1720 to 1780, and certain parts of Europe goes all the way to about 1800. Rococo versus Baroque, compare and contrast, you can see the radical difference. So for Baroque here, we have the first international style combining all the different elements. Look at the simple difference between here. Absolutely gorgeous painting technique, empirical details, beautiful atmospheric perspective. But this is about Jesus and the battle of good and evil, Protestants versus Catholic, who's responsible for Jesus, who has the right Christian message. This is about a man trying to look up a woman's dress, and during this time period, there was no underwear. So he's trying to get a quick peek of her private areas while her servant is actually pulling her from behind and kind of hiding in the shadows. And note, even Cupid here is bashful, leaning over. Rococo then, as we look at this. Ooh, we'll see that in a moment. Europe was ruled by a number of women. So the idea of fantasy, play, and wit on a frivolous society, which is ultimately going to bring them down. Arts developed that we had never had before, like chamber music. Art not for the church, but for a small group of wealthy individuals that can afford to pay a professional or a group of professional musicians to play. We're going to get the arts of letters and writing these lovely little letters back and forth. And the idea of seduction becomes really a game in itself, particularly in places like Versailles. It's going to have what many people say is a feminine decorative look, probably referring back to the Europe ruled by a number of women. Now, I don't know if it's feminine and decorative, but it is pastel color. It is becomes what we consider feminine the time period because the European ruled by a number of women. So because they were ruling by women, we are calling it feminine, not that it just inherently is feminine. And then we now teach that cultural doctrine all the way down to the modern day world. This is a time period when pink became associated with women. Remember, in the Sistine Chapel, God was wearing pink. Jesus had on pink robes. So it was never a feminine color before. We start to define those things. Women hosted these artistic salons. So wealthy women would invite the best painters, artists, sculptors in to create this salon style that we'd actually be able to look at all the different artwork from that's being done in the local city or in the local province. And so artists also had a chance to share their artwork and see what others were working on. And it's amoral, not immoral, amoral. There's not really morality within it. It's not about teaching. It's not about didactic. It's not about being a better Christian or a better ruler or a better upper class citizen. It really is about fun. It's about the idea of a self-indulgent lifestyle coming out of heinous wars that let's enjoy the peace while it lasts. So one of the most famous then is here the swing by the artist Fragonard. And I should say critics hated this art movement. If you've seen the movie Frozen, you've seen this before, with the swing puller slightly behind him over there. The most famous characterization of this at all is this, and it's the Palace of Versailles, which is really a Rococo masterpiece. It is done by Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, from 1683 to 1715 is his life. And he is the one who is very famous for saying, I am the state, or the state, it is me. This Versailles was started off as a hunting palace, and they basically converted it over to the southern style, because it's about 60 miles south of Paris, to the actual ruling proceeds or the ruling environment of all of France, who was one of the world's superpowers. It's done by Charles Lebrun and an individual man by Mansart. Mansart is really the interior decorator and the individual who did the Hall of Mirrors. You see the beautiful work that shows up. Here's the Queen's bedroom with this gorgeous gold. That gold is gold. The King's bedroom, note, still associated with pink. And so we are still working on those gender role dynamics. And it becomes this overwhelming, this is where carriages would come in. So the court etiquette was created here. Lebrun and Mansart, actually after they created it, had to create numerous bedrooms and palaces associated with Versailles because nobles were now required to live here. And so he basically moved the entire government south from Paris. And each room is allegorically represents something about the king's heroism, about his hunting, his warring, his decision-making, his relationship to God. Everything is actually thematic and allegorical. So the Rococo glamorous and frivolous lifestyle is a huge precursor to poor classes revolting during the neoclassical age, which is our next time period. Why? Because this is great if you're wealthy and you're running the government, but who's farming? The poor. Who's making this material? The middle class. So the vast majority of individuals, as you see by our United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of no poverty, the vast majority of the population is still poor. And these are the people that are living in this resplendent lifestyle and eating these resplendent meals and having these resplendent rituals, which really make no sense. These individuals' mothers would actually farm off, that lived at Versailles, would farm off their own children to be breastfed by a poor woman and raised by a poor woman till they are of suitable age to come back. That way a wealthy woman's breasts would not drop. She could appear young and prim and proper. They would have these lovely parties that go to Cythera Island. So here's pilgrimage to Cythera Island, which is where the goddess of love supposedly lives. And so they're actually out to go and play little love games from 1717. This is wonderful if you're wealthy. If you're poor, you start looking at this hedonistic lifestyle and really start to get offended.
Fascinated by the Rococo was Frederick the Great of Prussia.
And I will pause
As a
here
young prince,
and end
Frederick
here
once wrote,
as we move farther north. But so you get an idea of the range that goes, Baroque leads into that Rococo, kind of that wit, that fancy, that pleasure, that individual decoration. The idea of theater and beauty become part of it. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day. I'll see you next week when we talk about neoclassicism, the transition from this wit and play and fantasy to the power to the people movement.